The locksmith wouldn't look her in the eye. He crouched at the front door of the house where Eleanor Graves had lived for 50 years, drilling out the deadbolt she had installed herself in 1987. And he kept his gaze on the metal because looking at the 73-year-old woman standing behind him with a grocery bag in her arms was more than his conscience could handle. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he muttered. "I've got a work order. New owner says to change the locks by noon." "New owner," Eleanor repeated. The words didn't make sense. Not arranged like that. Not about this house. "Yes, ma'am, a Mr. Gerald Graves." He glanced at his clipboard. "Transfer of deed recorded last Tuesday." Gerald, her son, her only surviving child. The boy she'd carried for 9 months, nursed through whooping cough, driven to college in a borrowed station wagon with a trunk full of everything she could afford to give him. Gerald had taken the house. Eleanor set the grocery bag on the porch step. Eggs, bread, a small carton of milk. She'd walked 6 blocks to the store because she couldn't afford gas this week, and now she was setting it down on a step that apparently no longer belonged to her. "Where am I supposed to go?" she asked. The locksmith's drill whirred. He didn't answer. Eleanor looked down the street. Barton, Virginia, a town of 4,000 people who all knew her name and most of her business. She'd taught Sunday school at the Methodist Church for 31 years. She'd organized the fall festival every September since before Gerald could walk. She'd made 316 casseroles for families in grief, counted them once during a sleepless night, and never asked for a single one in return. And now she was standing on a porch that used to be hers, holding nothing, owning nothing, watching a stranger drill her out of her own life. The locksmith finished. He stood, wiped his hands on his jeans, and held out a clipboard. "I need you to sign here. Acknowledges the lock change." "I'm not signing anything." "Ma'am, if you don't sign, I have to call." "Then call." Eleanor picked up her grocery bag. "But I'm not putting my name on the end of my own life in this house." She turned and walked down the steps with the careful, measured dignity of a woman who had learned long ago that falling apart was a luxury she couldn't afford. If you've ever had someone take something from you that you built with your own hands, your own years, your own love, and then ask you to sign off on it, this story is for you. Because what Eleanor Graves found next didn't just change her life. It rewrote the history of a town that thought it knew everything about the woman it had watched grow old. Subscribe now and stay until the end, because the mansion Eleanor is about to discover has been waiting for her longer than anyone alive can remember. The story of how Eleanor lost everything starts, like most tragedies, with a man who was supposed to love her. Harold Graves married Eleanor in 1974. For 50 years, they built a life that was modest in every measurable way and enormous in every way that mattered. Harold worked the lumber mill. Eleanor worked the post office and raised 2 children, Gerald, born in 76, and Catherine, born in 79. Catherine died at 19 in a car accident. Eleanor never fully recovered, but she kept going because that's what women like Eleanor did. Harold handled the money. Eleanor trusted him completely, the way people trust the ground beneath their feet, without thinking about it, without questioning whether it might one day open up and swallow them whole. Harold died on a Thursday in March, sitting in his recliner. Heart attack. Quick. Eleanor buried him beside Catherine. The whole town came. Gerald flew in from Richmond, stayed 3 days, and left with a box of tools and a promise to call every Sunday. He called twice, then stopped. The first letter from the bank arrived 2 weeks after the funeral. The mortgage on the house she'd believed was paid off since 2005, carried an outstanding balance of $187,000. Harold had refinanced 3 times without telling her, each time pulling out equity, depositing the money into an account she'd never seen. The total withdrawals came to $267,000. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table for a very long time. The ground beneath her feet had opened up exactly the way she'd never imagined it could. She couldn't make the payments. not on Social Security of $1,400 a month and Harold's pension of $620, reduced by early distributions she hadn't known about. Gerald came 6 weeks after the funeral. He sat across from her and explained that transferring the deed to his name was the smartest move. Tax purposes, estate planning, no probate complications. "Nothing changes," he said. "You can live here." She signed, because he was her son, and she was tired, and she didn't have a lawyer. 4 months later, Gerald sold the house for $340,000 to a developer. He didn't tell her. She found out when the locksmith showed up. He'd also emptied their joint bank account, $11,000 that was supposed to be her emergency fund. When she called him, Gerald's voice was flat. "I sold a property that was draining money. You should be thanking me." "You stole from your mother." "I managed assets." His voice hardened. "Dad left a mess. I cleaned it up." The line went dead. Eleanor understood with horrible clarity that the two men she'd trusted most had both decided she was worth less than money. Tap like if you've ever trusted someone who treated your love like a line of credit they could drain whenever they wanted. Because what Eleanor did next surprised everyone, including herself. She didn't collapse. She didn't call the police because Gerald was technically right. The deed was his, the account was joint, and the law, in its blind and mechanical way, was on his side. She didn't beg. She didn't scream. She packed. 1 suitcase, 2 boxes, clothes, photographs, her mother's Bible, the quilt Catherine had made in 8th grade home economics with crooked stitches and a lopsided heart embroidered in the corner. Everything else, 50 years of furniture and dishes and curtains and memories, she left behind, because it belonged to a house that belonged to a son who belonged to a version of family she no longer recognized. She walked to the Methodist church. Pastor David Whitmore found her in the back pew at 4 p.m. with her suitcase beside her. She told him everything. "You can stay in the church cottage," he said. "It's small, but it's warm. Stay as long as you need." "I can't pay rent." "Eleanor, you've served this church for 31 years. You don't owe us rent." The cottage was a single-story building behind the church. 1 bedroom, a closet kitchen, a shower that took 3 minutes to get hot. But it was quiet, and no one could take it from her. She found a rhythm. Morning coffee, walks to the post office, afternoons organizing the fall festival. Without the house, her monthly income was $2,020. After food, medications, and the small expenses of existing, she had roughly $40 left each month. She never told anyone how tight it was. She mended clothes, ate oatmeal 3 nights a week, turned the heat to 62, and wore 2 sweaters. She never called Gerald. 3 months after Eleanor moved into the church cottage, a woman named Ruth Thatcher knocked on her door. Ruth was 81, sharp as a tack, and had been the town clerk of Barton for 43 years before retiring. She knew every property record, every deed transfer, every boundary dispute in the county's history. She also knew Eleanor, because in a town of 4,000, everyone knew everyone. And Ruth had been buying Eleanor's casseroles at church fundraisers since 1982. "I heard what happened," Ruth said, settling into the cottage's only armchair with the authority of a woman who had never in her life waited for permission to sit. "About Harold, about Gerald, about the house." "It's done," Eleanor said. "Maybe, maybe not." Ruth opened a folder she'd brought with her. "I've been going through some old county records. Not because of you. I do this for fun, if you can believe it. Retirement is boring. But I found something." She laid a document on the kitchen table. It was yellowed, brittle at the edges, handwritten in ink that had faded to brown. "This is a property record from 1923. It lists the original parcels granted to families who settled this area. One of those parcels, Lot 14, Section 7, Barton Township, was granted to a family named Whitfield." "I don't know any Whitfields." "Your mother's maiden name was Whitfield." Eleanor went still. "Margaret Whitfield," Ruth continued. born 1928 in Barton. Married James Harwood in 1950. Had one daughter, Eleanor Harwood, born 1951. That's you. I know my own family history, Ruth. Do you know about Lot 14? Eleanor shook her head slowly. Ruth pulled out another document. This one was a survey map, hand-drawn, with careful measurements and compass notations. Lot 14 is 47 acres on the North Ridge, above Miller's Creek. According to county records, it's never been sold, never been transferred. The original deed is still in the Whitfield family name. That can't be right. My mother never mentioned owning land. Your grandmother owned it, Harriet Whitfield. She died in 1961. There was no will filed with the county, which means the property passed by intestate succession to her only surviving heir, your mother. When your mother died in 1998, it passed to you. Eleanor stared at the map. You're telling me I own 47 acres? I'm telling you the county records say the Whitfield family owns 47 acres, and you're the last Whitfield. But Eleanor, there's something else. Ruth pulled out a printed photograph. It was grainy, taken from a distance, but the image was unmistakable. A house. Not a cabin or a shack. A house. Large, 2 stories, with a wraparound porch and tall windows and a stone chimney that rose above the tree line. It sat in a clearing surrounded by forest, invisible from any road, invisible from anywhere unless you knew exactly where to look. That's on Lot 14, Ruth said. I drove up there last week after I found the records. The road is barely a road, more like a logging trail. But the house is there. It's been there for over 100 years. Eleanor picked up the photograph. Her hands trembled. Why didn't my mother ever tell me? Ruth's expression softened. I don't know, honey, but I think it's time you went up there and found out. If you've ever discovered that your family kept a secret that could have changed your entire life, stay with me. Because what Eleanor found inside that house didn't just answer her questions. It raised new ones that would shake the entire town of Barton to its core. The road to Lot 14 was everything Ruth had warned about, and worse. Pastor David drove. His old pickup truck groaned over ruts and rocks, branches scraping the sides like fingernails on metal. Eleanor sat in the passenger seat gripping the door handle, watching the forest close in around them until the sky was just a narrow strip of blue between the treetops. They'd been driving for 20 minutes when the trees opened into a clearing, and Eleanor saw it. The house was larger than the photograph had suggested. It stood in a meadow that had once been maintained. You could see the ghost of a lawn beneath the wild grass, the outline of what had been flower beds along the foundation. The wraparound porch sagged in places but held. The windows were intact, most of them, clouded with decades of grime but not broken. The stone chimney rose straight and solid against the sky. It wasn't ruined. It was waiting. Eleanor got out of the truck. The air was different up here, cooler, carrying the smell of pine and something old and enclosed, like a room holding its breath. The front door was heavy oak, swollen in its frame. She pushed, and it gave with a groan that echoed through the house like a sigh. The house was furnished. Not abandoned furnished, preserved furnished. Chairs around tables, books on shelves, a coat rack by the door with a woman's hat still hanging from the top hook. The kitchen had a cast-iron stove, mason jars still holding the dried ghosts of preserved vegetables. The dining room had a table set for 4, plates, glasses, silverware, all under a fine gray film, but otherwise untouched. My God, David whispered. This place has been sealed up for decades. Upstairs, she found 3 bedrooms. On the nightstand in the largest sat a framed photograph. A woman in her 40s, standing on the very porch Eleanor had just climbed. That's my grandmother, she said. Harriet Whitfield. David looked around. Somebody was maintaining this place. The roof isn't leaking. The floors are solid. Someone had cared for this house long after the world forgot it existed. In the third bedroom, the smallest, tucked under the eaves, Eleanor found a desk. Oak, heavy, with brass handles on the drawers. She pulled open the top drawer. Letters. Dozens of them, bundled in ribbon, sorted by date. The handwriting was her grandmother's. Eleanor recognized the sharp, elegant script from birthday cards she'd received as a child. Cards she'd kept in a box under her bed until Harold moved them to the attic, and she forgot to retrieve them. She sat at the desk and began to read. The letters spanned from 1955 to 1961, the year Harriet died. They were addressed to no one, not letters to a person, but entries in a conversation with herself, a journal kept in letter form, as if Harriet needed the structure of Dear Someone to organize her thoughts. The early letters were practical. Notes about the house, the land, the property taxes she paid each year. She wrote about planting the garden, repairing the porch, replacing shingles after a storm. But as Eleanor read deeper, the tone shifted. Harriet wrote about her daughter, Margaret, Eleanor's mother, with a mixture of love and worry that felt painfully familiar. Margaret had married young, moved to the other side of Barton, and slowly stopped visiting. Harriet wrote about waiting for phone calls that didn't come, about sending letters that received no reply, about the growing silence between a mother and daughter who had once been inseparable. Then Eleanor found the letter that changed everything. It was dated April 3, 1959. The handwriting was shakier than the earlier entries, as if Harriet's hand had been trembling. I have decided. The house and the land will stay in the family name. I will not sell, no matter what Thomas Crane offers. This land was my grandmother's before it was mine. The creek, the ridge, the clearing where the old chapel stood. These places hold memory that money cannot replace. Crane says the timber alone is worth a fortune. He says I'm a foolish old woman sitting on gold. Perhaps I am. But gold doesn't remember your name. This land does. Thomas Crane. Eleanor knew that name. Everyone in Barton knew that name. The Crane family had been the wealthiest in the county for 3 generations. Thomas Crane Sr. had run the lumber operation that employed half the town. His son, Thomas Jr., had expanded into real estate and development. His grandson, Thomas Crane III, currently sat on the County Board of Supervisors and owned the development company that had bought Eleanor's house from Gerald. The same company, the same family. The house Harold had mortgaged, the house Gerald had sold. It had gone to Crane Development, LLC. Eleanor's hands went cold. She kept reading. The later letters grew more urgent. Harriet wrote about pressure. Visits from Crane's lawyers, offers that increased each time, veiled threats about property taxes and zoning changes and access roads. She wrote about a fire that burned her tool shed, about a fence that was cut in the night, about a survey crew that appeared on her land without permission. The final letter, dated November 12, 1961, 3 weeks before Harriet died, contained a single paragraph that Eleanor read 4 times. I have hidden the deed in the place Margaret will remember if she ever comes back. The lawyers say the land is safe as long as the family name remains on the records. Crane cannot take what he cannot find a way to transfer. I have told no one about the house except the one person I trust to keep it standing. He promised, and I believe him because he loved this land before Crane ever saw the timber and counted dollars. Eleanor looked up from the letter. The house. The untouched, preserved, secretly maintained house. Someone had kept their promise. David, she said, I need to find the deed. They searched for 2 hours. They checked drawers, closets, floorboards, the spaces behind picture frames. Eleanor tried to think like her mother, tried to remember what places had been meaningful, what locations carried memory. Then she remembered. When Eleanor was a girl, her mother used to take her to a spot along Miller's Creek where a flat stone jutted over the water. They'd sit there in summer, feet dangling, eating sandwiches and watching the light move through the trees. Her mother called it the Reading Rock because she'd go there as a child to read books away from the house. "The place Margaret will remember," Eleanor murmured. She walked outside, past the meadow, down a slope thick with ferns and fallen branches. David followed, confused but quiet. The creek was louder than she expected. Rain had swelled it, but the flat stone was there, unchanged, jutting over the water exactly as it had 40 years ago. Underneath the stone, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed in a metal box bolted to the rock's underside, was a leather envelope. Inside the envelope was the original deed to Lot 14, Section 7, Barton Township. 47 acres, including the house, the creek, the ridge, and the clearing where the old chapel had stood. The deed was in Harriet Whitfield's name. And attached to it, in a separate envelope, was a letter from a lawyer dated 1958, confirming that upon Harriet's death, the property would pass to her sole heir, Margaret Whitfield Harwood, and upon Margaret's death, to her descendants. Eleanor held the deed against her chest and cried for the first time since Harold died. Not from sadness, from the overwhelming, crushing weight of discovering that she had never been as alone as she thought, that her grandmother, a woman she barely remembered, had spent the last years of her life protecting something for Eleanor to find. Not money, not gold, a home, a place that couldn't be mortgaged or sold or stolen because it had been hidden so carefully that even the most powerful family in Barton hadn't been able to touch it. Tap like if you believe that the people who love us sometimes protect us in ways we don't discover until we need them most, because Eleanor's story is only halfway done, and what she found next inside that house made the deed look like the smallest of Harriet's gifts. Eleanor moved in on a Saturday. David organized it. His truck, 3 men from the church, and a stream of townspeople who showed up without being asked. Ruth brought cleaning supplies. Martha Chen brought a generator and LED lanterns. Frank Morrison got the well pump working. His son rewired the main floor. Nobody asked Eleanor to pay. They just showed up, worked, and left food on the counter. By the end of the first week, the house was livable. Not modern. The stove was still cast iron, the bathroom was an outhouse Frank was threatening to replace, but warm, clean, and solid. Eleanor slept in her grandmother's bed, and for the first time in months, didn't wake at 3 a.m. with her heart racing. As she settled in, she continued reading Harriet's letters, and the story they told grew more complex with each page. Harriet hadn't just been a woman living alone in the woods. She'd been a midwife, one of the last in the county who still practiced the old ways, delivering babies in homes when hospitals were too far or too expensive, or when the mothers, for reasons the letters hinted at but never stated plainly, couldn't go to a hospital. The letters mentioned names, dozens of them, families Harriet had helped, deliveries she'd attended, children she'd brought into the world, mothers she'd nursed through complications that would have been fatal without her knowledge. But some entries were different, marked with a small cross in the margin. These described visits that happened at night, women who arrived alone, frightened, bruised sometimes, women whose husbands were powerful, whose families were prominent, whose situations were complicated in ways that 1950s Virginia did not have language for. Harriet helped them all. She asked no questions. She took no money from those who couldn't pay. And she kept meticulous records, dates, names, outcomes, in a separate ledger that Eleanor found locked in the desk's bottom drawer. The ledger's final entry was dated October 1961. It recorded a delivery, a girl, 7 pounds, healthy, to a woman identified only by initials, MCMC. The Crane family. Eleanor sat with the ledger in her lap and thought about Thomas Crane, the patriarch who had pressured Harriet, who had burned her tool shed, who had tried every legal and illegal tactic to force her off the land. And she thought about his wife, a woman named Margaret Crane, who, according to Barton's official history, had suffered poor health and spent the last years of her life in seclusion. Harriet had delivered Margaret Crane's baby, in secret, at night, in this house. And 3 weeks later, Harriet was dead. Eleanor didn't know what it meant. Not yet. The ledger raised questions she couldn't answer with the information she had. But she felt, with the instinct of a woman who'd spent 50 years watching people lie to her face, that this was the reason Harriet's land had been coveted so aggressively. Not for the timber, not for the acreage, for the secrets the house contained. She kept reading, she kept searching, and the house kept giving. In the attic, behind a false panel that Ruth discovered when she noticed the wall measurements didn't add up, Eleanor found a cedar chest. Inside were baby clothes, hand-sewn, delicate, wrapped in tissue paper. A birth certificate, unsigned, listing only the mother's initials and the date. And a photograph of a newborn girl held in the arms of a woman whose face was turned away from the camera. On the back of the photograph, in Harriet's handwriting, "The child is safe. She will be loved." Eleanor brought the photograph downstairs and set it on the kitchen table beside the ledger, the letters, and the deed. She looked at the constellation of her grandmother's secrets and felt the weight of a story that was bigger than property or money or family betrayal. Harriet had protected someone, a child, and she had protected the evidence of that child's existence by sealing it inside a house that she then hid from the world. The question was, who was the child, and where was she now? It took Ruth Thatcher 2 weeks to find the answer. Ruth, with her decades of access to county records and her bloodhound instinct for documents, cross-referenced the birth date from the unsigned certificate with hospital records, adoption filings, and census data. The child born in Harriet's house on October 14, 1961, had been placed with a family in Richmond through a private arrangement. No agency, no court filing, just a handshake and a promise. The family's name was Porter. The child's name was Helen. Helen Porter. Now Helen Porter Vance, 64 years old, living in Charlottesville, a retired schoolteacher with 3 grown children and no knowledge that she had been born in a house on a ridge above Miller's Creek. "She doesn't know," Eleanor said when Ruth told her. No, the adoption was completely private, no paper trail except what Harriet kept. Why did Harriet keep it? Ruth was quiet for a moment. Insurance, maybe, if anything happened to the child, or if the Cranes ever tried to pretend she didn't exist. Eleanor looked at the photograph of the newborn. She's Thomas Crane's daughter. And Margaret Crane's, born in secret because... Ruth paused, choosing her words carefully. Because in 1961, in a town like Barton, there were things that families like the Cranes couldn't allow to be public. Margaret had been ill for months before the birth. The official story was a nervous condition, but Harriet's ledger tells a different story. What do we do with this? Ruth looked at her steadily. That depends on what you want, Eleanor. You own the land. You have the records. The Cranes have spent 60 years trying to get their hands on this property, probably because they suspected Harriet kept evidence. If you go public... I'm not interested in hurting anyone, Eleanor said firmly. Not even the Cranes. I'm interested in the truth, and I'm interested in making sure that woman, Helen, knows where she came from, if she wants to. And Gerald? The house he sold? Eleanor's jaw tightened. Gerald made his choices. I've made mine. She wrote a letter. It took her 3 days. She wrote and rewrote, trying to find the words that would open a door without breaking it down. She told Helen Porter Vance who she was, the granddaughter of the midwife who delivered her. She told her about the house, the letters, the ledger, the photograph. She told her that the information was hers to do with as she wished. Pursue it, ignore it, ask questions, or burn the letter and forget it ever arrived. She mailed it on a Tuesday. Then she waited. The call came on a Friday evening, 2 weeks later. Eleanor was sitting on the porch, her porch, on her land, watching the sun drop behind the ridge, when her phone rang. Mrs. Graves? The voice was steady but fragile, like a glass held too tight. This is Helen Vance. I received your letter. Thank you for calling. A long pause. Then, is it true? All of it? Every word. Another pause. Longer. Eleanor could hear breathing on the other end, the careful, controlled breathing of someone trying not to fall apart. I always knew, Helen said quietly. Not the details, not the names, but I always felt it. Like a missing piece you can't see, but you know is there because everything around it is shaped by its absence. Would you like to see the house? Eleanor asked gently. Your grandmother, your birth grandmother, she built something beautiful up here. And I think she built it partly for you. Helen arrived on a Saturday morning in early November. She drove up in a modest sedan, got out slowly, and stood in the clearing looking at the house with an expression that Eleanor recognized. The same expression Eleanor had worn when she'd first seen it. Not shock, recognition. Like meeting someone you dreamed about before you knew their name. They walked through the house together. Eleanor showed her the letters, the ledger, the photographs. Helen held the picture of herself as a newborn and traced the outline of the woman holding her. Margaret Crane, her birth mother, who had died in 1973 without ever publicly acknowledging the daughter she'd given away. She was trying to protect you, Eleanor said. Harriet's letters make that clear. Margaret loved you. She just couldn't keep you. Not in that family. Not in that time. Helen sat at the kitchen table and cried. Not loudly, just the quiet, steady tears of a woman who had spent 64 years wondering and had finally been given an answer that was both beautiful and heartbreaking. They talked for hours about Harriet, about Margaret, about the Cranes who had spent decades trying to erase the evidence of a child they considered inconvenient, about Eleanor's own story, Harold's betrayal, Gerald's theft, the locksmith on the porch. We're both women who were erased, Helen said. Me by a family that pretended I didn't exist. You by a family that decided you didn't matter. And we're both still here, Eleanor replied, in a house that was hidden to protect us both. They sat on the porch as evening came, two women who hadn't known each other existed a month ago, watching the light fade over land that had been waiting for them longer than either of them had been alive. If you've ever found family in the last place you expected, stay with me, because the story doesn't end here. The Cranes found out about Eleanor, and what they did next forced the entire town to choose a side. Thomas Crane III learned about Eleanor's claim the way powerful men always learn about threats, through a $500 an hour lawyer monitoring county records. His first move was legal. Lawyers filed a challenge arguing the chain of title was broken. Mara Hendricks, a young attorney Helen knew, took Eleanor's case pro bono. The chain of title is solid, Mara told Eleanor. Intestate succession is automatic in Virginia. Crane's challenge is frivolous. He's betting you'll walk away. I've been walked away from enough. Crane's second move was less legal. The access road to Lot 14 was blocked by a fake construction project. When Eleanor tried the back way, fallen trees appeared, cut with a chainsaw, not wind-toppled. Eleanor went to the town council meeting. She'd never spoken at one before. My name is Eleanor Graves, she said. Most of you know me. I taught your children Sunday school. I made casseroles when your parents died. 3 months ago, my son sold my home to Crane Development. I found my grandmother's property on the ridge, land that's been in my family for 100 years. And now Thomas Crane is blocking my road and filing lawsuits to take that from me too. She looked at the council members. 3 wouldn't meet her eyes. I'm not asking for favors. I'm asking you to be honest. There used to be a line where decent people said enough. I'm asking you to find that line again. Janet Purdy moved to investigate the road closure. The motion passed 4-3. The investigation revealed the construction project was fabricated, authorized by a county employee who'd received $5,000 from a Crane-linked account. The road reopened. The employee was terminated, and Thomas Crane found his name in the newspaper next to words like misconduct and potential charges. His lawyers escalated. Motions, subpoenas, demands for proof. Each filing designed to exhaust a 73-year-old woman. But Eleanor had the town. Ruth handled records. David handled logistics. Martha kept the house supplied. Frank kept the plumbing working. And Helen drove down every weekend, sat on the porch, and reminded Eleanor why the fight mattered. "It's not about the land," Helen said one evening. "It's about whether people like us get to exist." "It's a little bit about the land," Eleanor admitted. Helen laughed, a warm sound that made the porch feel worth defending. The legal battle ended quietly. The facts were overwhelming. Harriet's deed was authenticated. The Crane family's history of harassment was documented so thoroughly that their own lawyers recommended settling. Thomas Crane III signed away all claims to Lot 14. He paid Eleanor's legal fees. He agreed to a consent decree prohibiting any Crane-affiliated entity from interfering with her property. He also quietly resigned from the county board. The investigation had turned up a pattern of self-dealing that made his position untenable. Gerald called once after the settlement made the regional news. Eleanor was sitting on the porch, her porch, on her land, in a house that her grandmother had hidden and a town had helped her reclaim, when his number appeared on her phone. She let it ring. Then she picked up. "Mom," Gerald said. His voice was smaller than she remembered. "I saw the news." Eleanor waited. "I didn't know about the property, about any of it. If you'd known I had something valuable, you would have taken that too." Silence. "I want to see you," Gerald said. "No." "Mom, please. I made a mistake. I was wrong. You sold my home, Gerald. You emptied my bank account. You left me on a sidewalk with a suitcase. And now that I have something again, you want to see me?" She paused, not for effect, because she wanted to say the next words exactly right. "I forgive you," she said, "because carrying anger at you is heavier than carrying the groceries home in the rain. But I don't trust you, and I don't want you here." She hung up, set the phone on the porch railing, and sat in the quiet, listening to the creek below the ridge and the wind through the pines and the sound of her own breathing, steady, calm, alive. Spring came the way it comes to places that have been waiting, slowly at first, then all at once. Eleanor planted a garden, tomatoes, herbs, beans, and roses, red and white, in a bed along the south side of the porch. Helen came on weekends with her children. Ruth came Tuesdays for coffee and the ongoing project of cataloging Harriet's letters. A university press was interested. David came whenever something needed fixing, which was often, bringing his toolbox and the steady companionship of a man who understood that sometimes ministry was just showing up. And Eleanor. Eleanor sat on her porch in the evenings and watched the light change over 47 acres that bore her family's name. She wasn't rich. The settlement hadn't included money, just the land and the legal fees. She still lived on Social Security and the small pension. She still mended clothes and ate oatmeal and turned the heat down in winter. But she owned something that couldn't be taken from her. Not by a husband who lied. Not by a son who stole. Not by a family that had spent 60 years trying to erase a truth that wouldn't stay buried. She owned her grandmother's courage. She owned her own refusal to disappear. And she owned a house on a ridge above a creek where, 100 years ago, a woman had stood against the most powerful family in town and said, "This land remembers my name. You can't have it." On a warm evening in June, Eleanor found one more letter. It had slipped behind the desk drawer, hidden for decades in the gap between wood and wall. The paper was so fragile it nearly crumbled when she unfolded it. It was addressed to her. Not to the heir or whoever finds this. To her. "Dear Eleanor, you don't know me yet, but I know you. Your mother brought you here once, when you were 3. You picked wildflowers in the meadow and fell asleep on the porch in the sun. I watched you and I thought, she has the Whitfield stubbornness. She'll need it. I'm sorry I can't be there to give you this place myself. I'm sorry the world is arranged so that women like us must hide what we love to keep it safe. But the house is yours. The land is yours. The truth is yours. Do with them what the Cranes never could. Build something that lasts, not because it's powerful, but because it's true. All my love, Harriet. Eleanor held the letter against her chest. The evening light poured through the windows. The roses bloomed along the porch. The creek sang below the ridge. And in a house that had waited 60 years for its rightful owner, Eleanor Graves, 73, broke, stubborn, and finally home, whispered 2 words into the quiet. Thank you.